Hello, and thanks for joining us for Historic Comics, Yellow Journalism, and Media today, our session for NCSS 2020. Thank you for joining us and taking some time. My name is Keith Patterson. I am the Associate Director of the Teaching with Primary Sources Western Region, and along with me is Kyle. I'll let him introduce himself.
Hi, my name is Kyle Kleiman. I'm the project coordinator for TPS Western Region, and I teach in the journalism department at MSU Denver.
So thanks for joining us. And today, as I mentioned, we're going to be looking at historic comics, journalism and media today. Before we actually get into the presentation, I would recommend that you maybe pause the video and go to that bit.ly link. That will get you to a copy of this presentation. And there's going to be some interactive components and some things that you may want to actually click on the links and look at the resources that we're referring to. And since this is a pre-recorded session, it might be kind of nice for you to be able to grab those, pause, and look at things as we're going through and take your time with some of the things we're doing. Some great resources, and we encourage you to dig into them further. Really looking at these great resources that are available at the Library of Congress that we're working with.
The only thing I'll mention just to make sure about the bit.ly link is that it has to be the capital NCSS and then lowercase comics.
So moving on now that you've grabbed that, hopefully. So just a little bit of information about who we are and where we work. So we actually work on a grant, the Teaching with Primary Sources grant from the Library of Congress. And our grant is based out of the Metropolitan State University in Denver. And we actually operate the Teaching with Primary Sources Western region. And so we work with projects throughout the Western United States and have counterparts in other parts of the country, which we'll discuss a little bit later. But really our big mission is that our goal is to help educators to access all the amazing resources that are available at the Library of Congress, and particularly those that are available online at loc.gov, the link that's linked there. And then really the second part of that is to effectively use those in the classroom. And that obviously can take a lot of different things since we're talking about millions of different resources, but really with the focus on the primary source materials that the Library of Congress collects and protects and makes available to the United States people, and especially in this case to educators, and how those can be used in the classroom. So just a little bit of background, just so you know, the collections we're working with. So the Library of Congress, as you probably know, is America's library. It was found in 1800, very early on in the history of our country. It was actually burned down in the War of 1812. It was housed in the Capitol at first, and that was burned down. And so in 1815, they decided to reestablish it by purchasing about 6,500 books from Thomas Jefferson. His collection is kind of important because he had such a breadth of knowledge. It's an interesting story to look into that, but that's kind of the core of it, and that's why Thomas Jefferson is kind of considered the father of the Library of Congress, because his books are kind of the first purchase in the heart of the Library of Congress. And today, that mission of collecting information to really be the knowledge base for Congress, and so they always should have the best information available to make their decisions. They now house well over 170 million items in the physical collections in DC, and then online they have over 60 million things that says they're that are available online for you to use. And so obviously that's a lifetime of information for you to explore and enjoy and use in your classrooms. You can see there it encompasses a number of different kinds of media, from manuscripts, books, visual materials like video recordings and other sorts of things, music, sheet music, maps, and including 3D items. And so just pretty much across the gamut, there's lots of information that kind of tells the story of the United States and the world through cultural collections. Largely in here, we're really highlighting some of the comic art that's available, which we'll talk about in our presentation a little bit more. Before we kind of jump to the project, I really want to highlight the TPS program, and specifically the TPS regional program. We have the privilege of working with the Western region, which you see there on the map of the Western states. But I do have counterparts in the Midwest and the Eastern region, coordinated out of Illinois State University and Waynesburg University. You can gather more information there at loc.gov/teachers, and then look for the Teaching with Primary Sources program. Or if you've downloaded this, there's a direct link to this information. But basically, our program is really focused around those two big things of accessing the resources at loc.gov and then effectively use them in the classroom. And we have grants up to $20,000 that are available for your organizations to do those projects. And if you are interested in doing some of that work, please reach out and get in touch. We have our regional centers that are here to help facilitate and get those projects going. And so Kyle's pulled up the actual web page and what that looks like. So today, now that we've kind of got who we are out of the way, here's our kind of our agenda for the next bit of time. And first, we're going to go through and just define a couple of terms so you know what we're talking about. We're talking about historic comics, yellow journalism, and what we mean by media and all those things. So we're on the same page as far as that's concerned. Then we're actually going to talk a little bit more about what yellow journalism is and the historic comics and how they relate to that. We're going to be talking about a specific comic collection that you can find some of their stuff at the Library of Congress called the Yellow Kid. And then we're going to dive into how to teach with that, as well as then we're going to then bring that forward and talk about how yellow journalism the lessons of yellow journalism can be applied to the media today. And then we're really going to go in and dive into some additional strategies and resources that you can use in the classroom.
Yeah.
With that, go ahead, Kyle.
Yeah. So a couple of things just to define terms about what is media and what is the media. So when we're talking about media, we're normally talking about this idea that it's the plural of the medium. So it's something that is communicated or expressed in whatever form we're talking about. It could be anything from an historical image to a meme. So the media, on the other hand, is the main means of mass communication that is regularly regarded as collective. So we're talking about Fox, CNN, RT, we're talking about all these big name, NBC, ABC, all these big name news organizations, but also things like Facebook, Twitter, and other social media that curate and distribute news articles too. So that little distinction in there. So this is a kind of like a good activity that you could use for your students. So we're talking about what image is real. On the left side, I think we kind of obviously know that the image is real. Abraham Lincoln didn't have an iPhone. The image to the right, however, is of Ulysses S. Grant. And it can look real, especially when you're asking the question, a leading question like this. So the answer is neither. The right is also a composite photo. So here's the original photo from the Library of Congress. And it contains a bunch of other photographs from the time. And the photograph in here, the one that I showed you before, was actually done after the death of Ulysses S. Grant in 1992. So what we're only really seeing is Ulysses S. Grant's face. We've got another general's body and horse, and then we have a completely different background. So when we're talking about fake news and photo manipulation and things like that, we also have to use those same type of skills historically as we would use it for the media today. So here are some examples of what historical thinking kind of boils down to. What we're looking at is multiple perspectives. That heavy, deep analysis of primary sources, whether it's close reading on a text or using the observe reflect question that I'll show you here in a little bit. Sourcing, so who, where, what, when, why, how was it created? Looking at all those aspects of it that might make it either misleading or have a different context to it. Understanding historical context, that's that piece of learning about the ideologies of the people, of society of that time and before and after, so you don't make conclusions based on today's ideologies. And then that clave evidence connection. So this is about connecting evidence, or at least what we can interpret from history, and making connections to the claims that are made, either through the individuals themselves. And this implies to the media today too. We're looking at online sources as not always fiction and not always fact as well. So this comes from the Stanford History Education Group. Their website is sheg.stanford.edu, but this is a fantastic chart that has some really great prompts. And if you download the whole PDF, it also has some teacher like assessment to tell if they're getting to this point or not. Also on Sheg is just tons. We'll share some more information about them later, but tons of amazing resources on Sheg for historical assessments and civic online reasoning. So when we're talking about the media today, critical media literacy is a fairly well-known media literacy analysis kind of strategy that we use in journalism, especially. And it comes from this idea that there's 5 core concepts to media. That principle of non-transparency, and it's all about that media messages are constructed, they're made for a reason. That second one is the codes and conventions. So how are these media messages being constructive, and what type of creative languages and rhetorical cues or images are they using to convey their message? So we have audience decoding as next. So this is really saying, who's the audience for? And if we look at the media today, especially, we're looking at places like CNN and Fox News, where they're pandering obviously to their audience base. Content and message is all about that vertical reading. Content and message, what's it saying? And why are they saying it? And whose point of view does it come from? Motivation, so this is all about that purpose and power. So why is that being published? How is it being published? Who is it being shared to? It's looking at the power dynamics within sources. So again, here's just kind of a little chart that we created that's got some questions that go with each of the critical media literacy principles that you can use in your classroom that kind of just point to each of the codes. And to show you kind of how they connect, there's so many cross-curricular connections that you can make that really complement each other throughout the learning process. And it's really the same type of inquiry, type of analysis protocol as the scientific method or close reading and language arts, or any other critical analysis protocols. We're looking at media and we're deciding whether or not it's good for us.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. And kind of keeping those things in mind, the critical media literacy, we find a really interesting way of kind of handling that is to go back historically and look at what these things looked like, more than 100 years ago. And a great study to kind of look at what this happens when some of these media tools get out of control. Especially when they're first introduced onto the scene. And we see some of that going on now with the transition to an online society. A very similar sort of situation occurred and has been occurring probably since then, when the introduction of some technology in the newspaper business came along. And it came with this thing that ended up being called yellow journalism. And this was a period of time at the end of the 18th century, right at the turn of the 20th century, 19th century into the 20th century, where there was a bit of a newspaper war that went on that led to a lot of strategies being used to sell media that caused some issues, which is interesting to look at with your students. And this yellow journalism really came out of the fact that there was a bit of a newspaper war in New York between a couple of magnates, Pulitzer and Hearst. And they really resorted, there was 2 big newspapers in New York City, and they were really battling over readership. And so they were really, really pandering to their audience in New York, which at the time was largely an immigrant population. And so they were really doing all they could to sell these newspapers and really drive the other person out of business. And so as you can see here, and probably may have read ahead, that they used a lot of these tactics, which I think a lot are still in use today and still work, whether it be newspapers or posters or the internet. So you see things like scare headlines, huge print, often for minor news, which if you're not seeing that, you're not looking at the internet right now. Lavish use of pictures and imagery and drawings, which obviously is a very effective way of gathering people's attention. Use of faked interviews, misleading headlines, pseudoscience, and a parade of false learning from so-called experts. And obviously these are hallmarks of propaganda and other things of that nature, and so should be looked at as such. And these are all these things that Kyle was talking about. These are things that can be drawn out using those protocols. Again, emphasis on full color Sunday supplements. This is specific to yellow journalism, but really shifting of that technology using full color and in comic strips and things of that nature, kind of really pandering to your audience and the things that they really like in order to draw an audience. And another big thing that happened with yellow journalism was the use of telling the story of the underdog and really pandering to that person who was downtrodden. Um, and so those were the big things. And so obviously these are things that were around before yellow journalism and still stick with us to today. So it's kind of interesting to hear a little bit more about it. So we like to share this next image. So this is actually a political cartoon from the time, and it's of Joseph Pulitzer there on the left, and William Randolph Hearst. Pulitzer ran The World, which is a newspaper in New York, and the New York Journal, I believe, is the one that Hearst was running. And as you can see here, they were having a bit of a newspaper war. And the outfits they're wearing are kind of where we're taking the next step with historic comics. So we'll talk a little bit more about where those came from, but that was a hallmark of some of the comic strips at the time, and this led to a newspaper war that we talked about earlier. Um, so if we move forward, so really the big example of yellow journalism and the problems it can cause are related to the Spanish American War. And you can see here are two front pages that were published on February 7th, 1898, right in the height of this time period. And you can see here a lot of those hallmarks of yellow journalism. Seeing here, we've got huge images, huge headlines, sensational stuff. These big, huge headlines. Destruction of a warship Maine was the work of an enemy. Big, huge titles. 4 times they mentioned in the New York Journal that there's a $50,000 reward. With who's going to pay that, and what's the reality. They knew they weren't going to pay that. Nobody in New York knew about what was going on there. But again, a good half of the page is images. They're making claims that turned out that weren't probably true, unsubstantiated claims. And so what the outcome of this sorts of reporting of this was that these newspapers really pushed public favor to drag the United States into the Spanish American War. It turned out that the bombing of the Maine was not very closely tied to the Spanish after it was all said and done, but there was some political stuff happening that wanted to see the world be, or the United States be dragged into this war. And so it really comes down into that. So it's an interesting case study if you want to look into that further, or if you're studying the Spanish American War, you're probably going to talk a little bit about this and can dig into it a little deeper. But it's also good just to look at this. This is a good point for you to pause and take an even closer look at some of these headlines and read through that, and then use some of those skills. Corroborate this across and see if these claims fall out to be true, or if these two pages even corroborate each other, and see what the real story was. And so it's just an interesting story to see that, it seems pretty innocuous at the time, but it really led to public favor being pushed and the United States getting pulled into a war.
Yeah, and especially for today, think about images. Like these two images are contrastly different. However, we see these kind of images done or used today in online articles where we have a picture of a politician that looks really good, and then in another article on a different website you have the same type of article with the politician in a terrible, he or she doesn't look good. So it can be really nuanced, but it's there for sure.
And also keep in mind that these are not photographs; these are artistic renderings, and so what they're reporting here, it could be completely made up. So so the next piece here is really how do you take some media like this and do an analysis on it to look at it. And so there's a good chance you've probably heard of the primary source analysis tool from the Library of Congress. And this is something in our program that is kind of a foundational tool that we use to look at primary sources. And it can be used across all grade levels for all different kinds of media. It's a very simple protocol that can be used. And we're actually going to use this real quick using this observe reflector question, or sometimes called what do you see, what do you think you know, and what do you wonder. So I'm going to turn it over to Kyle, who's actually going to take a political cartoon from the time period, and we'll do a quick mystery photo analysis of it.
Yeah, so this one's, it's just called a mystery photo. It's all about giving students a source or an image or something that they haven't seen before. It can be done at the beginning of a session if you want to kind of start priming their thinking, activate that background knowledge, or it can be done at the end for an assessment. During is also nice too, just to kind of suss out information and evidence. So as Keith mentioned, it's 3 basic steps. What do you see? What do you think? What do you wonder about? So we'll just start with observations. Keith, what do you see?
Let's see, just right off the bat, the big focal point in here is a guy in a red suit. I'm also seeing that there are a bunch of men climbing on a square box or a machine of some kind, and it looks like they're dumping something into it. There's a ladder that they're climbing up. It looks like there's papers flying through the air with words on them. I think that's probably a good start. And note that I'm not drawing any conclusion at this. I'm just basically pointing at the image and telling you what I see. And
Yeah, this is all about finding those concrete, evidential things that you can use. Like the guy was wearing red because of this, or he was wearing a jester suit because of this. So that's where you kind of get that evidence from. So the next step is, Keith, what do you think is going on?
Well, looking at this a little closer, I think that might be a printing press because I see newspapers coming out of it. And I see that people are putting something that looks like money because I see the money symbol. So I think I know what that means. And they're pouring money into the top, and out is coming newspapers. And then looking at what they're saying, there looks like they're might be making some claims about the things that are being printed in the newspaper, such as appeals to passion, venom, attacks on honest officials. And then I see on the other side that there are people who are nervously grabbing for these newspapers.
Yeah. So what
And
do you?
so I think that might be that there's being money put into a machine to give bad information to the people.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Keith. And notice too, in this step, it's really, I think, important for the teacher to not hold any judgments, or to not say any judgments, and to hold all of those back while students are kind of just listing all of these things they think is going on. Because it doesn't matter if it's wrong or it's right, as long as it's backed up evidence, then they can go do more research to find out, or they can have another aha moment. So the next step is the question step. So Keith, what do you wonder about?
I wonder what time this may have been printed. Who are these people? I'm assuming the guy in the red suit there is an important figure. So maybe that's an actual person, and I'm not quite sure who that is. I see that there's some other people. I wonder who they are, where they live, where is this newspaper being published? Things of that nature.
Nice. Yeah. Thanks, Keith. And the questions is all about launching points for further research. It's all about saying, okay, how many questions can you come up with, and how many answers do you want to try to find in those questions? So these are really good questions here. So here is just some other ideas that you can use with primary sources like this, especially like political cartoons. You can have students create a caption, you know, and then add a identifier, make them create a clickbait article headline, so they actually have to hone in on some of those key things. Thought bubbles are always great. Put up some thought bubbles and say, what do you think these people are talking about? What do you think they're saying?
Yeah. For instance, the guys in the crowd there might be thinking, they look like there's might be some anger. Some might be saying like, "Can you believe this stuff? I'm going to go attack my enemy," or something of that nature.
Yeah. So the next one, we got reword the image about to be about today. Reword the image to be about the antithesis. I always like that one. Have students create something that is for the position that the political cartoon is arguing against. Recreate the image for a present day medium, so put it in a meme or put it in a GIF or a TikTok video or whatever. Find an image that's already created and explain how it's kind of similar or different, make some compare and contrasting observations there. You can interpret the image through another's given critical position. So like what would Jeff Bezos say about this position, or what would Noam Chomsky say about this position? So you have really competing ideologies there that might get into some interesting discussion. You can go all the way back, talk about ethos, pathos, logos in terms of like real critical analysis, criticizing and defending the medium. So like, would this be better if it was presented as an essay? Or would this essay be presented better as a political cartoon? How would it reach more people? Things like that. So yeah, you can alter it, analyze it, how it changed the message and how it changed the original purpose, recreate it from a completely different perspective. And so here's where the image source comes from. It's available to you on the Library of Congress website. Amazing more resources too on the yellow journalism, yellow kid, which we'll get to here in a sec too.
So next step really is to talk about a particular comic that was during the same time period and how it kind of had an impact on yellow journalism. And we're going to be looking at this comic called The Yellow Kid. And actually, it was never called The Yellow Kid. It had a number of different names, but it was he was an incredibly loved character at the time, and he actually was published in several different comic strips. But you can see the Yellow Kid is denoted by this little yellow, I guess, oversized shirt, and he's bald. And he actually, people don't know, but he actually represents a racial stereotype. And you'll see it in the time period. There are a lot of racial stereotypes that show up in this if you look closely at this. And I'd encourage you to pause and take a look and see what I'm talking about. But really, he was a kid that would have been living in the immigrant areas or the tenement areas of New York during this time period, the turn of the 20th century. Bald because lice was rampant, and so a lot of these kids had their head shaved so they wouldn't get lice. And really just a little snapshot of what life was like in the tenements, and some of the inequity that was happening at the time between the people living in the tenements and the upper crust kind of people. In this particular one, it's a comic that's a commentary on them installing gas lines in New York and how the rich people you can see off to the side or have a fancy walkway so they don't have to deal with it, but all the tenement and poor people are having to live with it. And you can even see that maybe it might not have smelled very good and so on and so forth. But fun to stop and just take a look at it and use that last protocol that observed with that question if you want to kind of look at that.
Yeah, I'll just mention too, while we're looking at this, by their very nature, comics are accessible to a broad audience and are often representative of the time and culture in which they're produced. So when we're talking about historical comics, we can also look at political cartoons from today. A lot of these are happening today too, in places like the New Yorker and other places that are online for free. Comic studies is nothing new, but serious and academic field in which scholars focus on art and producers of comics, sequential art and graphic narratives as they pertain to fields of art history, social studies, language arts, semiotics, philosophy, ontology, epistemology, ethics. It runs the gamut. Comics are also rich with social justice issues, especially historical comics.
Just want to show this. So the Yellow Kid, as we mentioned, was created by a comic called Occult, and he was, like I said, published in at the turn of the century. He actually appeared in both Pulitzer's and Hearst's newspaper. They kind of stole back and forth, and he appeared in different comic strips in the newspaper under different names. This is actually a patent application drawing, as he was trying to patent it so he could monetize the kid as much as possible. His efforts didn't actually end up working out for him. But like I said, he became kind of one of the most popular comic strips of the time. And it's also interesting that his connection to yellow journalism is that At the time period, yellow was one of the first colors that they could print in color in the newspaper. And so that's why he ended up being in a yellow shirt, was because of the time, with the notion that probably his shirt was stained yellow from all the dirt and grime and living and not washing clothes quite enough. He also used that space on his shirt as a billboard. So often what he was saying was printed on that shirt, which we can see in some of our examples. Um, but it is also interesting to note that this is a racial stereotype of Irish kids, which we don't see anymore, and really was denoted what was going on in the tenements in New York City at the time.
Here's a quote from R.F. Occult in a interview from 1902. He says, "The yellow kid was not an individual, but a type. When I used to go about the slums on newspaper assignments, I would encounter him often, wandering about the doorways or sitting down on dirty doorsteps. I always loved the kid. He had a sweet character and a sunny disposition, and was generous to a fault. Malice, envy, and selfishness were not traits of his, and he never lost his temper."
So here's just an example of one of his strips, and they tended to be some of these scenes was one of his typical formats. Though he also showed up in the comic strip format where you see different panels, and is actually the first comic to do that as well. But these are probably the most funnest to look at these scenes because there's just so much to look at, and really rich for looking at what life was like in these cities. And so when you look at this, and you can kind of pause this or even pull up the thing and get a higher quality version of this. But you can ask questions like, where is this located? Describe the setting. How was the artist depicting life in New York in the late 1800s? What people, animals, and objects do you see? Describe what characters you see. What groups are represented? What biases and stereotypes do you see in this image? What do you wonder about? Who is included or excluded in this melting pot of New York of the time? How does the text connect to these images? And what do you notice about the words in this panel? One thing I always notice about the words in the quotes they put in here is there's a particular written kind of almost a slang, I'd say. They're kind of written in a broken English, which probably was mimicking the way that they talked on the street and the tenements. So it's kind of interesting to kind of try to read through that and have conversations about why it was written that way. Just wanted to put this up. This was actually the last appearance of the Yellow Kid in comics. It's kind of fun to show this as we close out talking about the Yellow Kid, because you see them kind of there in the foreground in his same outfit, but you can see he has a bald head and a beard, and so it's kind of them kind of retiring the character.
Yeah, and you'll notice too, if once you start investigating a lot of these Yellow Kid comic strips, is that the same types of characters come into it, the same patterns, the same type of clothing, all of that stuff. So you can kind of see some themes within a whole.
Yeah, a lot what we call memes. There's things like, and we'll take a look at it in one of the examples here in a second. So teaching with the Yellow Kid. Yeah, like I said, there's obvious connections to the tenements, and we can look at a couple of ways that we can use that. Obviously, pairing this with some literature from the time period. I think there's some links to some reading lists about tenement life in New York, and this actually gives you a very interesting, different eye into it, because a lot of times they, in the photographs that you'll see of it, of the area, they wouldn't necessarily cover some of the people that were there, or some of the other things that were going on, or some of their issues. So this actually gives you kind of a satirical glimpse into what life may have really been like during that time period. One of the activities I like to do is comparing and contrasting images with the comics, which we can look at some of those next.
Yeah, let me just say too, there's a comic scholar at the University of Arts who is a part of the TPS consortium, and they have some amazing resources you'll see later in the presentation. But he mentions that when students are given a comic to read, it is not simply a shortcut past prose. Rather, it is teaching them to read pictures with the same weight and complexity we expect to find in words. So it's just as deep learning as an essay would be.
So with this, we'll go through this pretty quick because we're running fairly short on time, but this is actually a photograph of Mulberry Street in New York City, right about the turn of the century. And here is from McFadden's Row of Flats, which is one of the versions of the Yellow Kid. And you can see a lot of similarities. And I would suggest that you maybe pause and do a really deep dive, observing, reflecting, and questioning on this image. And an adaptation of that is then to replace that with a modern day picture, either looking at the original photograph and a modern photograph, or swapping with the comic with the recent photograph. What is the same, what is different? There's a lot of things that you can dive into there. And real quick, here's just another way that you can use some of these historic comics that we like to use. It's called a zoom in activity. And what you can do here is just kind of take that observe reflect question and turn it on its head a little bit and kind of break it out into different pieces. This is a nice way of doing it. And again, you can just pause and do these steps as you like, but just slowly revealing different parts of the image. We find this is a really nice way of breaking out that observe step, because you can only see a little bit at a time. So it reduces the amount of information that your students can see. And as you can see, the scene slowly builds, and we've put some prompting questions in here, but you can adapt this in any number of ways. And eventually you get to the full thing, and it's a kind of a commentary on the early adoption of automobiles into the city, which is an interesting take on the history of the time period. Kyle, you have anything you want to talk about there? Yeah.
Just to let you know, this is a really easy thing to do. I just did it in Google Slides. Just put the image on there, on the slide, copy and paste it to however many slides you like, and then crop each one so they're all in the same place. And it's really easy to do. So just to kind of wrap up and to bring it back to the media today, we're talking about yellow journalism, which is like fake news, disinformation, propaganda, satire, and those are all different things. Slightly, there's gray areas between them all, but it's really about looking at the specifications, the characteristics of each piece, and saying, okay, what is going on with this? How can we discern whether it's credible or reliable? And here is just a really quick slide to show you what that looks like. The one that I wanted to focus on, though, is this next slide about lateral reading. And this comes from Sam Weinberg and Sarah McGrew over at the Stanford School of Education, the Stanford History Education Group. And when we're talking about like reading laterally or reading vertically, we're talking about how we can utilize our online environment in order to help us understand the information we're digesting. So reading vertically is all about those critical analysis strategies like close reading and things like that. So it's looking at the text itself and saying, what is going on with this in just the text itself? And when I say text, I mean any kind of media that has information or meaning in it. Lateral reading, on the other hand, is this idea of looking at the source, or even before, is to just go outside of the source and corroborate that information and open up another tab and say, hey, does this newspaper say the same thing? Does this publication say the same thing? So you can kind of help corroborate your evidence, do some fact checking. And it's about investigating a site by leaving it. So this would be this is a great example of when lateral reading would come into play. This is 2 editions of the Wall Street Journal. They both have different headlines. And this picture was shared through Twitter and went viral, of course. So here we have one headline that says Trump softens his tone. And here we have another headline that says Trump talks tough on the wall. So we have 2 very contrasting rhetorical tones in these headlines. However, it's not, upon first glance, it looks like some insidious thing that's happening, that the Wall Street Journal is pandering to its audience. But what happens in publications sometimes is that in the morning publication, they put it out, and then in the afternoon publication, they look at some of the analytics that comes through with selling and people reading the first publication, and then they update it accordingly. So this was really just an editorial update, but it could have been construed as like a propaganda effort. RT is another great one. This is a extremely popular website in the US. It is fully funded by the Russian government. And if you didn't know that already, it would be fairly easy if you knew this, if you had these strategies that we've been talking about, to pick out the headlines and the pictures and what they're talking about, and just see what bias you think they have. It's obviously Russian. It's obviously against, a lot of certain people in the States. It's a lot of fear tactics kind of things. Um, Really colorful pictures. I mean, even their entertainment news about the crown is really just about Trump. So look at information, or look at these websites um, outside of them to find out about what they're really about. Here's another good one that you can use with your students. Have them search minimum wage, or have them just go to minimumwage.com. Discern the credibility of that web page, because I won't reveal anything right now, but you can find out that minimumwage.com it has some interesting background information to it. Oops, sorry. Okay, so now where to find the yellow kid?
And we're running a little short on time, but yeah, so the entire New York Journal collection, which was Hearst's newspaper, I believe, is a good portion of that is actually found on the Library of Congress, and we've linked it there for you.
This is
Yeah.
the Civic Online Reasoning stuff from Stanford History Education Group. Check this out. There's really good plug and play assessment for building these types of skills.
And this is where that lateral reading, they cover that pretty heavily in that particular site. Yeah, Chronicling America is another place where you can find comics, because it's a historic newspaper collection covering hundreds of years of newspapers, mostly in the United States, but it covers a lot of stuff. So it's a great place to look for historic newspapers. That particular political cartoon came from a satire magazine called Puck, and it's full of great political cartoons like this. So it's linked there, so you can check those out.
Web Comics Archive is another good one, where they just kind of have a bunch of different websites you can go to that they've categorized.
More collections, the cartoon drawings collection at the Library of Congress, and we can kind of just scroll through these because there's a bunch of different collections that have stuff. But you can certainly pause and take a look at these.
Beyond Words is another good. This is a crowdsourcing done for transcribing historical images and comics.
Yep.
Here's where that University of Arts thing comes from. TPS member out of Philadelphia.
It's just a great resource, grab and go for teaching comics in the classroom.
Yeah, and it's if you go to the link, it's a free PDF to download that's got a bunch of resources and strategies. Here's another presentation that we did at Pop Culture Con in Denver last year, just about what it means to like teach in the gutter.
And as we wrap up, we also want to mention that the TPS Consortium runs this TPS Teachers Network, which is a social learning site where you can join thousands of other teachers who teach with primary sources. And there's lots of stuff about teaching with primary sources, as well as even just teaching with comics as well. And you can get in touch with us there as well. So we'd recommend you doing that. It's tpsteachersnetwork.org. And if you go there, you can sign up, just simple sign up with some information, and you can get in and continue the conversation. Here's our contact information. Again, the link to this presentation, if you didn't grab it at the beginning, it's all there for you. And please reach out. Our emails are there, and we can certainly answer any questions or talk more about grants or anything else related to Library of Congress and Teaching with Primary Sources.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.